frozen solid. So they proceeded to dig out a very excellent old mastodon that at some remote time had been frozen in the deepest freeze in history. This animal, after having been thawed out, was in sufficiently good condition for some of the miners to try a steak or two. We are also not informed as to how digestible this was. But in the stomach of this frozen animal was a partly digested meal of tropical ferns. Now we can't just talk this off. There has to be an explanation for it. And this explanation follows rather closely into the general belief of ancient peoples, including the very ones that Roy Chapman Andrews talked to, and who influenced his search in the Gobi area for various remains. That what were called the great northern areas, the Polarian world, was once a magnificent garden world. Not due to the fact that the poles alternated and brought the equator to the pole or something of that nature, but due to the fact that what we call the incrustation of the poles with ice was a gradual process which could only occur after a long period of geological history. So it didn't begin that way, but only came to this degree when certain other changes resulted in the distribution of the various temperatures and climatic areas of the earth. The same type of thinking reminds us that the Greeks, including Hesiod and other ancient ones among them, describe a race of beings called the Hyperboreans. The Hyperboreans, as their name implies, simply means above the winds, or beyond the winds. The god Boreas was the god of the winds. And of course the word hyper means exactly as we use it in connective form today. Thus we have a race of peoples living beyond the winds. These people the Greeks believed to have come from the north, that they actually were from beyond the point where the storms came from. Therefore, their world was not stormy. Their world was a very beautiful one, filled with gardens and fountains and everything that was lush and beautiful. Yet they came from the extreme north, far beyond the abode of the winds. This again seems to be a legend tracing from some early structural change that took place in nature. But that such a land could have existed where now a snow waste stretches and the earth is seldom if ever unfrozen more than 12 inches below the surface. That such a land did exist, we know from the contents of the mastodon's stomach, because he certainly didn't travel several thousand miles before he could digest a meal. Now some may think that he was frozen and drifted into his present location in deep freeze. But the direction of the drift would have had to bring him from a colder and colder spot. There is no way, apparently, that we know of in which any of these glacial sweeps could have been from the south to the north. Therefore, he had to have been frozen in an area which was cold when he started. And we have no knowledge of any reversal of this situation. So that it seems to be almost inevitable that there was something in that region. While we know that the glacial period retired, it did not retire by the glaciers moving north. It retired by the glaciers melting, leaving behind the residue from themselves. Therefore, we have now two ancient peoples specified by the Greeks and by the Hindus, the Polarian peoples and the Hyperborean. Now, such a distribution, as we have mentioned, probably did not limit itself to the human race or anything resembling it. It was probably part of the old legend of a paradise. In your old rabbinical lore, we find a differentiation between the term paradise and Eden. In some ancient accounts, Eden is regarded as existing in one of the corners of paradise. Sometimes the order is reversed, but they are not identical. And it would appear that what the ancients were trying to tell us is that there was some kind of an ethereal world in which the Garden of Beauty existed, and that also there was a primordial paradise of some kind on earth that perhaps plays back to the legends of the Golden Age, that plays back to the infancy of man. Now, we do not assume that this paradise was a garden in which a prototypic Adam and Eve of the pure Nordic variety were wandering around without very many clothes on. This paradise was in all probability a lush area in nature, a riot of life forms, gradually developing, and that it in all probabilities contained archetypally most of the forms of life that have since developed and distributed themselves around the earth. That they may well have moved downward, slowly, over periods of millions of years, following the lines of earth crystallization, taking by degrees what land came into existence, encroaching as wild growth encroaches on a deserted city, encroaching upon the uninhabitable, until finally it was able to inhabit all of it. This creeping of growth is one of the most common things we notice in nature. Cut out an opening in the clearing, in the jungle. Leave it, and in a month it is gone. Nature has closed over it again. You take machetes and you go down into the dry, thin jungle of Central America. The dry, bushy jungle of Yucatan, only 10, 12, maybe 20 feet high at most. You take a machete and you cut a path through it, 6 feet wide and a mile long. And by the time you reach the end of the mile, there is no trace of the beginning of the path you cut. Everything closes in. And you cannot even find your way out again. You can say it's easy, just follow the cut-off branches. You can't even find them. It has happened time and time again. All this happens by nature moving, and nature at the poles moving downward, relentlessly, with every available inch of land that could support. The same thing you see in Sicily, where you see life growing as near as it dares to grow, to the very edge of the volcanic fields of Etna. You will find lava pool bubbling, and 1.5 foot away, a little plant trying to live. The moment this earth becomes capable, life moves into it. And according to the ancient belief, life moved inevitably until it covered, moving from its first perilous foothold at the beginning of this area at the polar region. Here also, if this differentiation took place as we understand it, we can understand why it was held or believed that in the dawn of things, in that once upon a time land, which precedes all history and all serious accounts of everything, that the gods came down from their own exalted and mysterious abodes and took up their thrones upon this ancient land, that this was their first homeland on the earth. Now we think, of course, of these gods as coming down, maybe like old Zeus with his thunderbolts, or Athena brandishing her spear, or something of that nature, but I doubt very much if that was what they originally intended. I think what they meant was that the gods were these overorders of life, that in their pure and radiant state dwelt in the spheres of light above and beyond matter, but that these are the gods that descended and became man-formed, or took upon themselves matter, thus descending into the shadows, descending into the darkness, and bestowing the orders of intelligence and consciousness according to the plan governing this procedure. That the gods truly took form and dwelt among us, and actually they were us. That we in some mysterious way are part of that great order that moved in upon the ancient polar region of the earth. In your Indian mythology and in other mythologies, your great mountain Samuru, or the original archetypal Kailasa, the great mountain of the gods, was in the magnetic atmosphere above the northern pole of the earth. Here also was the sacred, mysterious Shambhala, the Chang Shambhala of the north, of the Tibetan Buddhists, and even of the Chinese Buddhists. Here was the imperishable land, the motherland, the place where all things are born and the place where all things will die. Here is the great route of the pilgrimage, which leads around the world and back again to the black sand of Gobi. It was a strange, almost fatalistic belief, reminding us of the great cycle of the Volsung in Nordic mythology. But these people firmly believed that this was true. And where else are we going to find an equally interesting, informative, and possible solution to some of these problems? For a long time we have suspected that humanity did come from Asia, particularly from that area of Asia, which is northern India and south of Siberia. We have also had for a long time the conviction that man did not travel alone, that life moved with him. For at that time man was part of this life, and to visible minds and to visible eyes, did they exist, there would be no difference between man and other forms of life. He would not be noticeably different. He might not even be a leader, because very often those creatures with potential leadership are sluggards in the early degrees of their growth, because they have too much potential work to accomplish. Their life is more complicated than creatures that mature more easily. Therefore growth is slower, and as in the case of man, who as in his childhood is the most helpless of the animals. Also in this situation, assuming the possibility that all these creatures move together, we begin to wonder a little bit how the various forms of life developed. And here the beginning of environment can be traced. And we can perceive how environment and what we term heredity could have had a marked influence upon the shaping of the early world. We know, for example, that the environment of this first world was very different from ours. We know that the light of the sun as we see it today was unknown, because the entire field of the planet was one mass of gases and mists and humidities through which light as we know it would not pass. Therefore this was a world of the twilight, a world of almost impenetrable gloom. Under such conditions you would have in these early manifestations very little of color. You would also have very little of sensory perception as we know it. We know the ancient Tibetan song about this, that in the beginning these creatures had hard bones that softened and soft bones that hardened. A kind of a strange contradiction in itself, but in a wonderful way summing up the whole mystery of evolution from our way of looking at it. These creatures probably had very few sense perceptions such as we understand. And of course they undoubtedly began as one or monocell organisms. Their methods of generation are unknown, but we assume by recapitulating backwards through what is known that in the beginning these forms must have been of increasing duration. Duration, or existence, has always been one of the primary factors in the so-called early times. Duration therefore meant that probably these forms of life were wiped out almost immediately. And in that way, many of them perished utterly. Gradually, the tenacity for survival.
Hey,
and the gradual accommodation to the circumstances of environment, which changed much more slowly than these creatures, resulted in the development of a resisting organism, an organism with greater and greater adaptability to the requirement of survival. The old legends tell us that this process went on until out of it was produced a practically immortal cell, a creature that was comparatively undying. In other words, it could have existed for 1,000,000 years. This creature changed not at all, having a complete sense of subsistence only about the thing that we would recognize most like it in our way of life would be a mineral, which continues indefinitely, yet is ultimately destructible. We also suspect that the mineral has consciousness, although we are not aware of how to determine its degree of internal awareness. That it is alive, we deeply suspect. But this type of creature, attaining an indefinite continuance, violated a law of nature. Indefinite continuance was not its primary crime. Its primary crime was that in achieving it, it attained a static state of unchangeability, and therefore gradually moved out of key to the fact that everything in nature was changing. Therefore, a division took place within this type of creature. And this division consisted of the challenge of change operating upon organisms. Certain organisms, perhaps those most long established and most deeply crystallized, did not make the adjustment. Others did. And gradually, the element of change, survival by change rather than by continuance, resulted in a new type of adjustment between form and circumstances. Out of this type of development, we began to find the need for bodies that were capable of retaining continuously the resilience of change. The only answer to this is that there's only one thing that changes easily, and that is the young. When things continue too long, crystallization makes them comparatively impervious. Structures that have had an almost endless endurance become so set in their own endurance as to become very difficult to move. And perhaps some of these primordial lives that have never changed belong to that type of life. Their continuance has become their death because they have been unable to escape from the forms they have built. Nature, not achieving her end in this way, gradually began to modify these forms to make it necessary that they change. And the modification consisted in the gradual introduction of fission, in which a separation took place within organisms, and reproduction was by kind of division. Nature was therefore able to continually introduce new elements and create increase, rather than to allow everything to remain unchanging. Here perhaps was the beginning of the population problem. But in any event, increase and change became essential. But nature, achieving her end, was again defeated. Having developed the concept of fission for reproduction, this fission continued until division brought life down to so minute a structure that it was gradually lost because there was no growth of the divided parts. These divided parts simply divided and continued to divide, and still continue to divide. And perhaps in this process of infinite division, we have the origin of the minute microorganistic life that we know today. Nature was therefore compelled to move in again. And in this type of motion, she bestowed the power of the divided part to equal the original, introducing now the element of growth, by means of which each of the divided parts of the cell gained the full estate of the total cell, producing two complete organisms, where there had been previously only one organism. This achieved a certain purpose, but again, in the great course of ages, this purpose defeated itself. For in this purpose we had multiplication without change. We had the infinite propagation of the same kind of thing. Theoretically, could this have gone on forever, like some plasmic growth under laboratory technique, we could ultimately fill the world with these cells, but there would still be no essential change in them. Now, all these processes are described in ancient writings in a rather allegorical way. They are described very often as sort of experiments in a universal laboratory. And they are also taught in the form of kinds of life that have existed in the dawn of time and then vanished away forever, as in the fantastic Chaldean history of Berosus. Here we have all this wild fantasy of generations. Nature, continuing on its way, was then found itself in the need to develop structures not only capable of infinite survival, but in the course of survival, the specialization and differentiation of powers, of faculties. And nature accomplished this through the gradual diffusion of all available energy resources throughout these total organisms. So we have our original monocellular creature, which is to differentiate into almost any form of life that we know now. We have it a kind of common ground. Hypothetically and symbolically, it is a sphere. Although this sphere might be flattened out by circumstances, it had the archetypal general design of what we would call a raw egg. It had a central nucleus surrounded by a protoplasmic field. It had other elements within itself also, but these two are the ones which we hear the most about in old thinking. Now, our amoebic progenitor, like the amoeba of today, has comparative lack of organic structure, but this does not prevent it from playing many parts in its time. It is in a way one of the most universal geniuses of all creation. A man becoming proud or overbearing in his conceit should really study the amoeba. It is a most humiliating experience. He suddenly discovers that an amoeba does not have to have a stomach. It's all stomach. And then by changing its mind, it is no stomach. A most convenient state of affairs. If it gets tired of being a stomach, it becomes feet. It is Proteus-like, capable of being all things to itself. Whatever it needs to be at the moment, that it is. It has no mouth because every part of its surface is a mouth. And when there is nothing in the mouth, there isn't any mouth. Most convenient. Also, it has no brain. As far as we can tell, it has no nervous system. But every part of itself is acutely aware. Therefore, if any danger approaches any part of the amoeba, it is equally aware of it. With man, he can have a pretty serious injury to his foot before the impulse reaches his brain. Not so with the amoeba. He is completely sufficient to his own requirements. His body becomes foot-like, therefore called pseudopods. When he wants to travel, he doesn't have to hire a car or buy a ticket in something. All he has to do is move into himself. He just pushes a part of himself in front of himself and then moves the rest of himself into it. wears out no shoes and has no troubles of that nature. All he has to do to travel is decide where he's going and gather himself around that point, and he's there. Now, in all probabilities, he is telling us really a very ancient archetypal story. He is telling us, perhaps, of the common field of sensory perception, from which all sensory perception specialization, as we know it, originated. Within him, perhaps, is the core of the possibility of experiencing. And gradually, out of this core, the infinite diversity of specialized experience occurs. In him we have, perhaps, the dawning of function. And with the dawning of function, the dawning of need. We find that this being, because it is sensitive to many circumstances which even man does not any longer recognize, it must also have been subjected to innumerable hazards. These hazards in turn requiring continually increasing adaptability for survival. So way back in those early days, we see the common creature whose various specializations we are going to trace in other forms of life.
Got it.
So perhaps our primordial beginning of man and of beast, of bird and of fish and of reptile, was this egg-like structure that was capable of being all that should ever come from it. Perhaps the outer membrane of this mysterious egg, which the ancients held with such sacredness in practically every religion that we know, perhaps this outer membrane was to become truly the outer part of man. Perhaps his skin, perhaps the whole of his epidermis, belongs to this ancient structure.